Roaring 20s of 100 years ago were not so roaring in Wyoming. While some of the characteristics of the decade, including flagrant disregard for prohibition, the banning of alcohol consumption from 1920 to 1933, prevailed in Fremont County, there was a notable lack of economic prosperity and plenty. The state dealt with frequent droughts and the bursting of an oil boom, so few Wyomingites experienced the Roaring 20s. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode, we looked at the history of automobiles and how they were essential to the development of tourism in Fremont County. We explored the history of road improvements and the inception of highways. Further, we investigated how interest in Yellowstone National Park was vital to developments in tourism and travel. This episode will continue with our theme of tourism and travel as we explore the story of the Great Depression in Fremont County and the impact Depression-era projects had on the tourism industry. Across the country, the prosperity of the 20s was brought crashing down at the end of October 1929. Multiple crashes of the stock market due to rampant speculation meant investments and deposits at banks around the country quickly dried up. Many banks folded and dissolved, unable to maintain their loans. At the same time, depleted topsoil from decades of wheat crops was swept away by wind and storms during a deep drought, turning the Great Plains into the Dust Bowl. The Great Depression was overseen by two presidents, each of whom took a different approach to solving the crisis. Herbert Hoover asked citizens to help fund increased spending, in addition to financing slow, large-scale projects. As a result, the impact of his projects was often minimized. The president was largely condemned for not doing enough both during and after his presidency. Elected in 1932 on a platform of providing a New Deal to the American people, Franklin Roosevelt tackled the challenges of the Depression from several angles. Small-scale work, restructuring of agriculture, and many different employment agencies characterized the New Deal, and its impacts are still visible across the nation and Fremont County today. In the 1920s, Wyoming was still a relatively rural population. Most of its inhabitants relied on agricultural or mineral employment, and in Fremont County, the vast majority of this was ranching. The state had experienced drought and deflation following the conclusion of World War I, which meant that livestock was hard to come by and extremely devalued. Lower prices for livestock, both cattle and sheep, meant that ranchers were encouraged to increase their production, both growing their land and their herds in order to have a chance of turning a profit. Acquiring more land and the equipment needed to tend to it meant that ranchers and farmers took on more debts than ever before. By the start of the 1920s, owner-operated farms without debt or mortgage dropped from 80% down to 50%. By 1930, only 30% of owner-operated farms were free of debts or mortgages. Taking on these debts meant that ranchers were subject to the country's markets and made much more vulnerable with the stock market crashes in 1929 and the following years. Building on the weak position of Wyoming farmers and ranchers, the start of the Great Depression was characterized by bank closures. Over the years, Wyoming had slowly exploded with banks. Many of them helped support the loans and mortgages taken out on farms and equipment built up locally. However, many banks had to fold when the loans exceeded the money in the bank. More than half of Wyoming banks closed in the 1920s, and this trend continued throughout the 1930s with the Great Depression. There are several examples of bank closures in Fremont County. Near the end of 1927, the Amoretti, Helmer, and Welty Bank folded in Du Bois. The institution had started around the incorporation of the town in 1914. Welty, of Welty's General Store, said he joined the other two bankers as he was asked to keep books for men in Du Bois. However, Welty said later, quote, "When he died, it was discovered that my partner, Helmer, had stolen $40,000. He had taken deposits and never recorded them. When the bank folded, thousands of dollars were lost by town residents invested in the bank, and it was a crushing blow to them. Started a few years after the Amoretti, Helmer, and Welty Bank, the Du Bois State Bank had its own considerable amount of investments from town residents, totaling over $60,000 in 1932. However, even this institution was unable to weather the Depression, and it closed in 1933, never to reopen. Riverton had its own share of banks and difficulties. The First State Bank of Riverton folded in 1924, a particularly bad year for Wyoming banks. It was among 22 other state and 12 other national banks that closed in 1924. The following year, in 1925, Riker Van Meter, president of Wyoming Tie and Timber, served as president to the new Riverton State Bank. Despite trying to support the growth of the Riverton area, the bank did not succeed. Van Meter told the Riverton Review shortly following the closure, quote, "In simple terms, more people needed loans than the bank resources could handle. There were plenty of borrowers, but few deposits." At the closure of the bank in 1932, commercial loans outnumbered deposits by more than $3,000. Bank closures compounded the issues of farmers and ranchers, also restricting spending from people who may have been better off as they lost their investments. People across the state began to restrict their spending, but while this saved money, the economy quickly stagnated. The Riverton Review in 1931 published an optimistic advertisement encouraging people to, quote, "help bring back prosperity" by spending 20% more than they were. Encouraging citizens to individually contribute to economic recovery and support relief characterized much of the early Depression. President Herbert Hoover was widely condemned for the actions he took following the stock market crash. However, his projects occasionally did have some impact, including large-scale projects with mostly local contributions. A 1932 initiative encouraged communities to build up municipal parks, celebrating George Washington's 200th birthday. Many large public buildings were started not under the Public Works Administration in 1933, but rather earlier under Hoover. Most significantly to Fremont County, the federal government began to accelerate road building efforts, focusing on the improvement of highways throughout the state. This trend would continue throughout the Great Depression. The national parks were also a focus of public works at the time. Starting in the late 1920s, there had been a focus on improving the road within the national parks, particularly Yellowstone. This was the start of intense concentration on improving roads, especially those leading to the national parks, throughout the Great Depression. Road work was particularly useful as a public project because it could be scaled according to the need for road improvement, brought in many people to complete the work, and also injected money back into the local community with workers living nearby during the project and by bringing in locals to complete the work. One major issue with Hoover's initiatives was a lack of public awareness, as many people felt that the president was doing nothing substantive to help with the Depression. His party was soundly voted out of office in 1932. Franklin Roosevelt based much of his campaign on making a New Deal for the American people, and following his 1933 inauguration, he tried to make good on that promise. The New Deal included dozens of programs, but they were focused on three main goals: relief for the unemployed, recovery of the economy to its past level, and reforming the economy so a depression of this kind could never happen again. The final goal was most clearly achieved in Wyoming following Roosevelt's inauguration with the bank holiday, where all of the nation's banks were shut down for a number of days, ensuring that they were fiscally sound before reopening. The New Deal's means of addressing relief for the unemployed and poor and recovery for the economy were both extremely visible in Wyoming. An alphabet soup of government and state agencies were created to provide relief. Some of these agencies changed over time. Many replaced or were made in 1935 as part of the Second New Deal. However, for many, these differences were not as important as the impact that the projects had for the people participating in them. The most visible and possibly largest project throughout the New Deal in Fremont County was road improvements. Highways had been built in the 1920s to accommodate modern automobiles, and the federal, state, and local government all financed highway improvements during the Great Depression. Most of these road improvements were local projects conducted under the umbrella of the Civil Works Administration, which would later become the Works Progress Administration. The Civil Works Administration, or CWA, covered a number of different small-scale projects, all aimed at employment relief. 90% of those employed by the CWA, and later Work Progress Administration, WPA, needed to be on relief lists. These projects maintained communities, improved municipal infrastructure like roads, sewers, and other utilities. Employment meant that people had money to spend in their local communities, boosting town economies as well. Roads and highways were improved to handle increasing motor vehicle traffic, including building new bridges. Over Wiggins Fork, in the Du Bois area, one of the last WPA bridges was removed around 90 years after its installation in the 1930s. Beyond the improvement of roads, WPA projects also improved towns for the better. Long put-off improvements to sewer systems were completed, including a long stretch in Riverton. Lander benefited from the Rural Electrification Initiative with the installation of a hydroelectric plant in Sinks Canyon powering the town. Small projects were also undertaken. A 2-cell jail was put up in Du Bois under the WPA. Many of the goals of the WPA ended up helping to modernize town infrastructure in interesting ways. Airports, or more appropriately, airstrips of dirt, were a common WPA and CWA project throughout Wyoming. Du Bois gained its first airport in this initiative. Placed atop Table Mountain, a few miles east of the town, the original project was overseen by town local Charlie Moore of the CM Ranch. The airstrip was rudimentary, barely more than a flat plain of cleared dirt. Some derided the effort to build airstrips as unnecessary waste on behalf of the federal government, but it did help keep more people employed. The airstrip in Du Bois proved to be of some use because although never attaining commercial status, the airport was later moved closer to town and continues operating today. Most visible to Fremont County residents were the Public Works Administration projects, sometimes later carried out under the WPA. These large-scale projects required more funds and often resulted in visible municipal buildings. This included the post office in Riverton, still in use today. Another large public work was the Wyoming State Training School in Lander, which is today the Wyoming Life Resource Center. Not all New Deal programs enjoyed the same success. Cattle, sheep, and wool were all selling for record low amounts at the start of the Great Depression, and in 1933, the government began offering to buy excess animals and destroy them. Stories included cows being shot and left to rot in the fields. Fremont Miller from Cohart remembered sheep being killed, skinned, and the rest being discarded. He said, quote, "My dad didn't like the idea of all of the waste, so he never sold any cattle to the government to be killed." Esther Mockler of the Du Bois area remembered of the program, quote, "Few ranchers participated. We didn't." Aside from the larger building and agricultural projects, the New Deal encompassed many smaller projects to encourage employment. The Federal Writers Project, meant to help writers, was often dismissed as needless expenditure, yet the project collected oral history data about pioneers, the origins of names, and legends. The information collected provides valuable insight into the history of the state at a time when many of its pioneers and second generation were still living. The 1930s was also a time of change on the Wind River Reservation. In 1938, the U.S. government finally legitimized the Arapaho half of the reservation, awarding the Shoshone over $4 million for breaking their treaty. The two tribal business councils also began meeting. However, many of the people living on the reservation were extremely impoverished during the Great Depression and in desperate need of aid. Reservation-specific programs helped address unemployment and bring in severely needed cash. Many of these projects were extensions of those going on in the rest of the county, including massive road improvements. The Wind River Irrigation Project built up the Washakie Reservoir, and a canal diverting water from Dinwoody Creek contributed to increased farming on the reservation. A hide tanning operation employed older women to tan hides and add beadwork, creating buckskin dresses and gloves, and transferring traditional skills from old to young. An industrial canning plant made use of crops grown on the reservation. An archaeological survey was one of the small projects undertaken by the WPA, ultimately employing around 125 people. The project was headed by trained archaeologists, but undertook to employ many others, including photographers, artists, surveyors, and 45 laborers. The survey, initially at the Dinwiddie campsite on the reservation, illustrates some of the challenges and successes of WPA projects. While it managed to employ many specialists, only 11 laborers out of the 45 came from Fremont County, even though the county had first opportunity to provide labor. Ultimately, the excavation concluded partially due to the expense of transporting many workers from Casper and keeping them away from home for extended periods. Perhaps the most popular program of the New Deal concerned the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. The CCC operated on federal land, working to improve national parks, forests, and monuments. As Fremont County is surrounded by national forest on almost all sides, there were several sites where the CCC worked in the county. Like many other New Deal projects, there was a heavy emphasis on road improvements, as well as upgrading some of the recreational areas in the forests. CCC workers also fought forest fires and removed diseased trees, replanting areas cleared. Northwest of Du Bois, CCC men built and improved roads. In Sinks Canyon, trail switchbacks were hand-cut by the CCC. Requirements for participating in the Civilian Conservation Corps were very strict. Enrollment was restricted to unmarried, unemployed men between 18 and 25 years old from families on relief. They were paid $30 a month, 25 of which went directly to their families, and they lived on site. While many of the workers were not from the areas they worked, there was still effort to employ local labor for the construction of CCC camps, and locals oversaw projects. Workers were often moved between camps to provide labor where it was needed, particularly in the case of forest fires. However, despite the difficulty of the work, the Civilian Conservation Corps proved popular both among workers and local people. The actions of the CCC boys were often reported in local papers, and the works completed in the forests and other government-owned lands are remembered orally almost 90 years after the projects were closed down. Experiences of the Depression and the New Deal varied widely across the citizens of Fremont County. Almost everybody was impacted by the economic effects of the Depression. The closure of multiple local banks meant that some people lost almost all of their money. Ranches and farms struggled with extremely low prices for the sale of their products. Esther Mockler of Du Bois remembered that in 1933, cattle sent to Omaha only sold for 5 cents a pound. Cloyd Miller of Crowheart noted that sending his cattle to Omaha would not even pay for the freight, so he held steers back a year. In many ways, the impacts of the Depression were more visible in larger towns. At the start of the crash, creditors not paying led to the closure of Fred Cook's grocery store in Riverton. Larger projects were also more often undertaken in larger towns, such as constructing schools and community buildings. Much of Fremont County was more rural. Mockler again recalled that, quote, "Never having had access to the amenities of life, we learned to depend on our own resources." Rather, the Mockler Ranch saw many itinerant workers and families pass through, trying to find better work elsewhere. In many ways, the start of World War II meant more hardship than the Depression. Wyoming did not benefit from the industrialization enjoyed elsewhere during the war. Only the railroad tie industry saw increased demand. However, many of those able to work or fight left. Mockler remembered, quote, "By the fall of 1943, all of the young men had been drafted or had enlisted. The older men left our area to work in lucrative jobs in war industries, and the women became Rosie the Riveters." The projects of the New Deal in many cases succeeded at their original goals, employing the unemployed and bringing money back into local areas. The impacts of many programs exist today, and the legacy of the work completed, from bringing in electricity, building of trails and roads, and creating municipal buildings that still stand today. The less visible impact of the New Deal, however, was on the people, both those living within Fremont County and outside of it. People were supported by the programs and able to maintain their families as a result of employment. Furthermore, projects like the Civilian Conservation Corps brought men who would otherwise likely never have traveled there into the national forests and national parks, experiencing the beauty and improving the resources of these places. The constant road improvements throughout the entire Depression meant that the previously rough roads were able to handle greater amounts of automobile traffic, and more Americans were traveling in their cars. Despite the Depression, the 1930s saw a steady trickle of tourists visiting the national parks via Fremont County. What had been a modest stream of tourism was revolutionized by the automobile age and the Second World War's prosperity, firmly lifting Americans out of the Depression and encouraging them to be more mobile than ever. Fremont County was poised to encounter growing waves of tourists. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode will focus on hotels in Riverton as we continue with our theme of tourism and travel. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, visit www.windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present. Thank you.